primary control with critical vehicle function.
Welcome to Future Thinking episode 107. This episode fits perfectly into our longer-lasting quest to understand complexity in society and how to handle it. I'm really thrilled about the opportunity to have a conversation with Johan Norberg. The title of this conversation will be How to Organize Complex Societies. Johan is a best-selling author of multiple books, historian of ideas and senior fellow at the Cato Institute. I read his last two books, Open, The Story of Human Progress, and The Capitalist Manifesto. Both are excellent books that I can highly recommend. We will discuss both books in the wider bracket of the challenge of, as I mentioned, how to handle complex societies. Before we dive into the conversation, let me do some housekeeping. First of all, the podcast is, as you know, free of ads. If you like what you hear though, please recommend this episode and of course the podcast to friends, colleagues and whoever you know, and of course as well post it on social networks. The podcast is largely German but has an increasing number of English episodes. On the website you can select for language. Just look at the tags on the top of the show notes. Speaking of show notes, please have a more detailed look at the show notes because you will find notes, quotations and reference to dig deeper to the topics we're discussing. Also, in this case, there will be a link to the conference and the interview of Johan with Elon Musk. Finally, even though the podcast is available on several platforms, I recommend using a podcast player and subscribing to the podcast. You will support the open protocol that podcasts are based upon, that is independent of large corporations, and also you will not miss any episode. Furthermore, you can browse well over 100 past episodes. Now, without further ado, Johan Norberg. Hello, Johan. Thank you so much for taking time for this conversation.
Thank you. My pleasure.
It's really very interesting because I read your last two books, Open and The Capitalist Manifesto, and I really would say they're a terrific read.
Thank you.
And I would like to kick off maybe from a different angle. Let's put it like this. I was thinking, or also because I'm researching for my book at the moment, I'm thinking a lot about complex systems, also complex societies. And my question to you would be maybe, if we go back to, let's say, the root of the issue, if you could call it like the problem of organizing complex societies in the sense of we have reached a high complexity level in our societies. And the question is, how can we manage that in a country, but also globally? Would this be an umbrella that you would say fit to your books or to your ideas more generally?
Yeah, I think that's a great starting point because my understanding of modern complex societies is a little bit counterintuitive for people who haven't really thought about it. People often think that the more complex society gets, the more we have to organize it and the more controls and commands are needed to make it function. And I'm of the definite conviction that the more complex the society gets, the less can this be organized. The more we have to exploit all the knowledge that's out there, the total sum of human knowledge, and that cannot be centralized. It's an insight from economics and from economists from Adam Smith to Friedrich Hayek, but I think it's more important than ever that all that knowledge only exists out there in individual human beings, and often it's not even verbalized. It can only be exploited and used in everyday interactions between human beings. And the more complex society gets, then the more simple rules do we need so that we leave openness for all this learning, the discovery process that's in there in every dynamic, thriving society.
It's interesting. The American economist Thomas Sowell writes in one of his books, roughly like that. He says it's much easier to concentrate power than it is to concentrate knowledge. And maybe we mistake the two because it's easier to centralize power. We might come to the idea that, well, great, then we can control everything. But if he's right, then I would guess now that you share probably similar opinion, then this might not be the best idea if it's not so easy to centralize knowledge.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Oh, I agree 100%. Unfortunately, I think there's an evolutionary tendency that we human beings have, that when we face a problem, we're looking for kind of the big man, our protector, a strong man, a big government to point out the right way. And perhaps if the problems are very simple, if it's just one raiding band, then we need to sort of organize our counter defense in a quick, simple way. That's not the kind of problems that we have in a complex society. It could be anything from new disease and new viruses, or a lack of growth, lack of innovation, or it could be that we have other forms of societal threats where if we're trying to centralize power, we lose the ability of thousands and millions of people of using their own local knowledge to come up with surprising responses to these problems. And that's why, yes, it's easier to centralize power than knowledge. And actually, when we centralize power, we lose knowledge. We replace the knowledge of thousands and millions and even billions of people who are constantly learning with the ideological preferences of a couple of people at the top. And that's really how we lose the ability to respond to strange, new, unpredictable problems.
I find it very interesting also because you referred before to, like, let's say, philosophers or also economists of the past, let's say John Stuart Mill, with his excellent book on liberty, which I mentioned in other episodes of this podcast already, but also Friedrich von Hayek. I mean, his book from the 1940s, I was really stunned because I read his The Road to Serfdom, I think is the English title. I read this book, was written, I think, 1944, and I was really blown away because it could have been written a year ago, in my opinion, because it is, except for the timely references to people, of course, of the time, but the content, I believe, is so timely. And this also reminds me of something an Austrian philosopher said, because he also referred to the idea of freedom that was developed, among others, by John Stuart Mill. And his idea, Conor Paul-Lissman, mentioned that over the, let's say, last 100, 150 years, we more and more lost the original ideas of freedom, like freedom from the state and the ability to do whatever we as individuals also please to do. And in my words, I would say we more and more came to sort of a nanny state, like we are delegating everything to the state and saying, like, I don't know, help me, state, in a way, or solve my problems. And even maybe the worst trend in the last years, I fear, is even more that the state not only helps us if we ask it, but actually tells us what we are supposed to do. Do you see this danger of this change of the idea of liberty?
Yeah, I think, it was P.G. O'Rourke, the great libertarian humorist, who said that there's only one real right in this world, and it's the right to do whatever you want. And with that comes the only responsibility, and that's to take responsibility for the actions you've done. And obviously, that's the only way how society continues to progress, because then we get new initiatives and innovations and experiments and trial and error. But it also takes the responsibility part of it, that when you fail, it's actually your loss. And that's how we learn. That's how we stop doing bad things and move on to the things that we're learning that are better. But obviously, that's quite an uncomfortable truth, because we want to be free, but we don't always want to accept the responsibility that comes with freedom. So obviously, there's always the tendency to try to get somebody else to step in and help us out of the consequences of our own actions, from an individual level and our mistakes in our personal lives to banks that fail and want a bailout from the government. I think that's the most easy and comfortable way out, but it's also exactly why we have to fight against it constantly.
Before we approach the ideas that you lay out in your two books, Open and the Capitalist Manifesto, I would like to maybe mention two more ideas from, let's say, contemporaries. One would be Elon Musk, who said in one recent interview, large projects are essentially illegal in California and Europe. So referring to the extraordinary amount of red tape and, I don't know, administration, what have you, so that it's really becoming hard to move anything. And that would fit sort of a bit hand in hand with what people like Peter Thiel or also Eric Weinstein and others are mentioning since maybe 5 to 10 years. Also, by the way, David Graeber, the unfortunately the late anthropologist, who talk about the stagnation actually of the last decades, except for maybe in IT. But when you see how many people are working in science, so that the number of scientists is growing exponentially over the last 100 years, but the output actually is not as great as we wanna see. Do you feel that we are a bit stuck in our ways?
Yeah, we do. I don't think it's a coincidence that we've seen impressive and disruptive innovation when it comes to digital technology, but not really in the rest of the world where we're building stuff or doing things here in real life, not with ones and zeros and bits, but with atoms and with molecules. And that's because the digital economy has been fairly unregulated and open according to fairly classical liberal ideas. But in this world of atoms, we have this exaggerated demand for control. And I think that's partly because we're graying, aging societies. We become, the richer we get, the older we get, the more risk averse we become, and we don't accept the kind of difficult trade-offs because, with all innovations comes the risk of failures and problems, and once in a while a disaster here and there, and we try to regulate that out of existence. And that's very problematic because the way to get to the future and the solutions to problems and disasters only comes from learning, and learning only comes from trial and error. So I think it's important that there is this tendency, often from entrepreneurs like Musk and Thiel, to talk about the problems of an overly regulated society.
By the way, you just mentioned the interesting word risk, and it reminds me to something one of my previous conversations was mentioned, namely, you say we became risk averse, and I would agree, but I think there is a paradox on here. It seems that the things we do to try to avoid risk actually increases the risk dramatically. Does this make sense to you?
Oh, exactly. And that's, I've done a lot to try to research innovations that we all love and cherish today, and everything from the semiconductor to the bicycle to the umbrella to the credit card. And basically, nothing comes from a committee, and nothing really comes from a brilliant genius who just comes up with an idea fully developed. It always comes from a process of experiments and trial and error and feedback and adaptation and changes and more people getting involved and markets testing, and then we come up with something better. And oftentimes in the beginning, people are afraid because, if there was a majority vote, people would have wanted to ban credit cards. They would have wanted to ban the internet, basically everything, because they could see the risks, the downsides of every new technology, how it would ruin us or lead to disasters. The one thing that helped us to deal with those risks was not to sort of block everything until we somehow figured it out in an immaculate conception style of way, how we would deal with it. We only learn to deal with the risks by experimenting and starting piecemeal and sorting out what works from what doesn't work, and therefore also deal with the risks and the problems in the long run. So if we're saying that, we shouldn't accept anything until it's perfectly safe, that's the most unsafe and risky bet we could do, because then we would lose all this technological capacity that we need to deal with the unpredictable problems.
Also, I think there's a second aspect to that. I mean, Nassim Taleb writes in his book about volatility that some people fear volatility, or the volatility per se is not it might be a problem for the individual, but it's not a problem for the system, for the society. Because if you have a small restaurant and your restaurant gets bankrupt, that's obviously not good for you, but it's not a societal problem. But the way we seem to do risk mitigation is like allowing bigger and bigger conglomerates, like these huge banks that are then too big to fail. And suddenly we indeed have a systemic risk because we didn't allow them to fail before, right?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. That's an incredibly important point. It's like the traditional metaphor is with forest fires. For a while, forestry started to stop every small fire that was taking place in forests. But they realized when they did that, you saw a growth in undervegetation and smaller bushes and old dead trees and stuff like that were just building up year after year until you really saw a dramatic forest fire. And then you had all that combustible material over there. And instead of having these small scale fires that we learned from constantly, we get these huge forest fires instead. Well, I think it's the same thing, definitely with the financial market. The central banks are always trying to stamp out every single problem on financial markets, every downturn, by injecting liquidity and lowering interest rates. And that feels good because no one wants to go out of business. But then, of course, the problem is that nobody ever learns and they never deleverage their positions. So they build up bigger and bigger leverage on their bets so that when eventually a real financial crisis strikes, you have all that combustible material, and what should have been a small downturn turns into a disaster. That's what I think happened during the global financial crisis 2008.
Before I interrupted you with the risk question, I think we were already partly in the territory of your open book, of a book about openness. Maybe you could give us a bit of an idea what you mean by openness and how openness is connected, in your opinion, with human success.
Yeah, to me, openness really means openness to surprises, to strange new ways of doing things in this world. And that's the only way that societies thrive and function long term. Because, if we want something new in the world, and we do, because historically life was nasty, brutish, and short. Only 200 years ago, more than 80% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty and life expectancy was 30 years. We need new things. We need new knowledge, new technological capacity, and wealth to acquire all this capacity to improve the world and improve our life. Where does that come from? Well, if it's something new, you need an openness to surprises. And that's my reading of history. Societies that have thrived, like the Western world in the past 200 years, more or less, but also historically, the golden ages of history, the ones that really thrived were the ones that were open to new ideas that were injected into science, into culture, into the economy. And that comes from two sources. It comes from the outside. It comes from trade. It comes from migrants and merchants and missionaries crossing borders so that you can combine different old ideas. And it comes from an inclusion of more people within your society. And that's really why societies have to be decentralized and not top-down controlled, because then you lose all that knowledge and that capacity for surprises that comes from giving more freedom, rule of law, property rights, freedom to experiment to more people back home so that they could use their local knowledge and individual creativity to build something new. That's the only way that societies historically thrive, I think.
You have a very interesting quotation in your book, that in the open book, which goes like that: it's not the triumph of the West, it's the triumph of openness.
Yeah, because sometimes we look at the world in the past 200 years and we see that, look, this is the first time that any societies have sustainably had economic growth and technological innovation and scientific breakthroughs, and it looks like the triumph of the West. But there are two problems to that story. And the first one is that many other societies have had golden ages in the past where they grew rapidly. Pagan civilizations like Athens and Rome, Muslim ones like Abbasid Baghdad, China under the Confucian Song dynasty. So in all of these different societies and different continents, we've had these periods of economic growth and scientific development. And what they have in common is that they were, compared to other societies at the same time, relatively open to new ideas, to strange new technologies and stuff like that. So it's that background that succeeds when something succeeds, and not that particular culture or geographical place. The other problem with the story of the triumph of the West is, of course, that until this recent moment in time, basically from the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution and the rise of liberal democracy, Europe was backwater. The Mongols didn't care much to invade Europe because China and the Arab societies were much richer, and there wasn't much back in Europe, because back then we didn't have that kind of openness that we got with the Enlightenment and with the Industrial Revolution. That's what created the wealth, not our particular traditions, but the fact that the West started to throw off old traditions that blocked innovation.
There's another claim in this book that I would like to, discuss. I mean, I recently read the very good book from Mervyn King, Radical Uncertainty, where he talks about, I think the core point is that in complex systems in general, but complex society in particular, when you bring something new, it's very hard to, or actually impossible to predict how this new thing, technology, process, whatever, will develop. You have a very cute cat.
Thank you. She's loud, though. She doesn't like that I pay more attention to you than to her.
Cats can be a bit...
Yeah.
Very nice.
Now we're
Okay, so the idea was like radical uncertainty. So the problem, I think, with new stuff when you make things more complex is we cannot predict the future, essentially. At least not in we will be surprised. We'll always be surprised in a way. And the more things we build, also unpleasant surprises can come. And you have this claim in your book where you write, under open institutions, people will solve more problems than they create. Now, what makes you optimistic in that sense? Because I think it is a fact that every increase in complexity, every new thing just creates challenges that we cannot predict.
That's right. I agree. That's the case. But if we were to do nothing, we would also be surprised by uncertain and unpredictable development. Everything from radical weather events to just the plain lack of technology that puts food on our tables and deals with our health issues. So there's no sort of unmovable center where we have this great stable situation and everything that's implemented afterwards interjects some sort of difficult uncertainty. Then what happens when we start to build and create and solving problems, we're also creating new problems. I agree, and often unpredictable ones. Most people around the world, their basic problem has always been, how do we put food on the table for our kids? And suddenly, some 100 years ago, we really started to solve this problem with better agricultural productivity, new crops, artificial fertilizer. Amazing development, one of the best developments in the world. But obviously, too much artificial fertilizer results in environmental problem. We suddenly realize that over-fertilize our oceans and river systems as well. And also, as we get more access to food, we create the problem of obesity. So, I mean, it's true, we create new problems. But the thing is, I prefer those problems. We create better problems. We've solved the ones that were existential threats to our life. And then we level up, like in a video game. We deal with the first level, and then we enter level 2. And there we'll see, okay, now we're going to have to deal with obesity. Now we're going to have to deal with the environmental problems from our previous results. We deal with microorganisms. It's always been the threat that a tiny cut in your finger could kill you. So we invent antibiotics, and that's great. But unfortunately, there's antibiotic resistance on level 2. So we're going to have to start to deal with that and come up with new ways of solving that. So it's true, we can never stand still. This is one reason why we always need to continue to build our societies and continue to grow, whether or not we feel like we're satisfied on this level or not, because there's always this pushback from previous solutions. And then also from nature itself that throws up some nasty surprises at us. But again, I prefer those problems to the ones that made life nasty, brutish, and short.
I think there might be also a second aspect to what you said, namely, what we like in Europe is things like the precautionary principle, for instance. But when you think about the precautionary principle, I think you very quickly run into the problem that, as we said before, the future is not predictable. So if you want to predict the problems of a technology, you should know what the problems will be, but actually you don't. So how can the precautionary principle work? And I think a very general problem that we have in our society is that people focus on the negative aspects of a new technology, but I think as an economist, you would call this opportunity costs, right? So when you do not use a technology, you have opportunity costs. You don't have the negative effects, true, but you also don't have the positive effects.
Exactly, quite true. I mean, if we I think the precautionary system is a complete failure of epistemology because it's really a way of trying to predict the unpredictable. And if you don't come up with any answers, that's sort of the absence of evidence is suddenly an important consideration to block certain technologies. And that just doesn't work. But I think it gets worse than that. I think if we could predict the problems that we see in the future and say that that's enough to stop a particular technology, there's still the case of, as you mentioned, of opportunity cost. Yeah, what does it mean if we don't implement these technologies? I mean, should we use fossil fuels? If we had known in advance that this would create global warming and result in a major problem, would probably have been banned. And in that case, we wouldn't have an industrial revolution. And in that case, most of the world's population would still be starving and in extreme poverty.
Or to use your example from before, we would have never been able to reach level 2 or level 3.
Exactly. We would be stuck at level 1 all the time. We'd never pass that level. And then we wouldn't acquire the technology that gives us capacity to deal with the problems facing us at level 1 and much less than, obviously, than at level 2. So I think it's a bizarre, super conservative principle, which basically says that no one should ever do anything that hasn't been done before. And if you think that nature in itself is a pretty brutal place for humanity, that's a bad principle.
I would like to now move to the topics of your second book, which is the Capitalist Manifesto. In a way, is I know I read it and I was really fascinated about it. Also because when you listen to most elites today, you read capitalism has failed and all the problems are due to capitalism, and then somehow your book about the Capitalist Manifesto sounded a bit like a provocation to me, and this is also why I obviously read it, and I found it very, very interesting. But I would like to maybe use one thing that you said about openness before to connect the two. Because you talked about the value of openness in new ideas and so on, but there's also a second aspect. As soon as we achieve something, there's the tendency, you could also call it the Matthew principle. Those who figured out something want to protect their knowledge from others, like patents or whatever tariffs or whatever you might want to call it. And so somehow my theory would be, when you get successful, you try to protect your success because the success also makes you in a way powerful. And so the question is, does openness in a paradox way lead to the opposite of openness and sort of undermines its foundations? And then we would have now a capitalism critic, if you will, in that.
Yeah, sure. There is that tendency that in every society, elites who have built their power or their wealth or their status on a particular system of ideas or of production, they have an interest in the status quo to protect that system of ideas or production. And that's nothing exclusive in a capitalist economy. This is one of the reasons why free markets didn't break through in most societies historically, because if someone invented a better textile machine or a primitive steam engine, it was blocked by the powers that be. So there was this great status quo filter in a way in every previous society trying to protect what they already had. But obviously that goes on even today. Once you've succeeded, once you've become an incumbent, then you want to protect that. It's like that old saying that, no one really likes small crying kids until you get one your own, and then you love it. And it's the same thing with monopolies. Nobody likes it until they've got one their own, and then they want to protect them at any cost. And this is really one of the major threats, I think, to free markets today, that we've got all these incumbents who lobby for regulations and tariffs and subsidies and bailouts for their own projects. And this is one of the reasons why I wrote the book, that we have to combat these ideas. The problem that I find is that lots of people who say that capitalism has gone too far, we have to regulate it, and talk about sort of we need a new industrial policy or we need tariffs and so on. They play into the hands of those incumbents. They are the ones who are protecting the old ideas, methods, technologies, and business models against the new incumbents. So that's why why I feel like I constantly have to make this case again and again, then that to defend free market capitalism is not to defend the current generation of capitalists, but the ones who will put them out of business unless they continue to innovate and create.
But that brings me to, let's say, a very basic question. We use the terms capitalism and free market. Not every listener here certainly is an economist. Could you maybe give us like your definition or idea what you understand? What does capitalism mean for you and what does free markets mean for you? And also you now distinguish two things, namely, is that what we have now, the capitalism or free market that you defend, or is it something different in whatever way? Could you maybe explain that a little bit?
Yeah, it is something different, because what I'm talking about when I'm saying capitalism is I basically use Karl Marx's definition. If you have a system where the decisions in the economy are made in a decentralized fashion, not by the government, when it's based on private property rather than government ownership of the means of production, and capital, goods, labor are free to move rather than commanded from the top, then we have free market capitalism. Therefore, I agree, capitalism is not a great word for this system. I prefer saying something like free markets or what have you, because capitalism, it sounds like it's all about capital. It sounds like it's about the capitalists. But in a way, it's the only system that exposes capitalists to constant competition from others. So I'd be open to using other words for it. But I've noticed that this word stays there in the debate, and then I prefer to have some books and articles defending the system using that word, rather than just books and articles that attack it. But it means if we want a real decentralized system of free markets where people are free to make their own economic decisions, then obviously we're not living in some sort of pure free market capitalism today, with a kind of regulations and tariff barriers, subsidies and bailouts, and governments often consuming some 50% of GDP, between 40 and 50% in developed Western economies. It means that there is much less freedom in those markets than I would prefer. When you look at both the left and the right nowadays, we often hear arguments for more state intervention, unfortunately. That's a reason why I wrote the book.
To circle back to the beginning, so my understanding would be, and please correct me if it's wrong, my understanding would be that your idea of free markets is essentially a concept of decentralized decision-making that is mediated by market forces or whatever that might be, that would help us to solve the problem that I asked in the beginning, namely, how can we organize complex societies? So I wonder, do we not have a bit of a psychological problem here? Because before our discussion, I was thinking, my gut feeling is that the socialist ideas have a significant psychological advantage in the sense of it's more accessible, in the sense of everyone has a family, and like the ideas that socialism seems to sell is like solidarity, and we are cooperative, and we like each other, and we are a group, and so on. This all is very cute and nice when you're a small group and when you're a family. But as Nassim Taleb says, as soon as you scale something, it changes its character. And the village is not a big family, and the city is not a big village, and the world is not a big village or something like, or not a big city. So is it maybe a marketing problem that you have to explain people that their quote-unquote socialist ideas are cute and nice for their family and whatnot, but they simply don't scale?
Yeah, quite right. That's an incredibly important point. And yes, the family metaphor is very powerful, very strong positive emotions about it. The problem when you're talking about trying to scale it is that, okay, there's a father or parents in charge, and the citizens are children, and someone makes all the decisions from the top and redistributes according to their own decision making. That's not really what we would want to scale if we were to. And the problem in a more complex, bigger society is that the kids have different ideas on what they want to do, how they want to do it. And in that case, it doesn't make sense with a metaphor that assumes this kind of central control and central decision-making over how resources are being used. So, yes, that is a marketing problem. I think the problem is that We understand the family, we understand the smallest tribes because historically that's where we come from. Whereas this large scale complex society where we constantly interact with strangers is something new and it's not instinctive. When we're trying to use the old instincts and metaphors to guide it, we have this kind of designer intuition that this somehow has to be controlled top down, like a tribe, like a household. Whereas the only way to organize a complex society of strangers with different interests and different ideas and different vantage points on the world is not to control it, but instead to give them the freedom to act according to their own individual creativity and individual dreams. And with that comes also then the freedom to reap the rewards when they're doing things that are beneficial to others, because that's the great thing about the market economy. You can get rich there, but only by enriching others and giving them some good services, capacity, knowledge that they are interested in.
Unless you prefer to live in an authoritarian society, right? But even then, there we know, look at North Korea and look at any of the authoritarian regimes. It's not like anything would be equally distributed there. Poverty might be equally distributed, but the elites, whoever they might be, still aggregate as much wealth as they can, right? So that's, it seems the distribution problem is not solved by top-down organization. But let me ask an additional question to that. Okay, let's assume your idea of free markets, but clearly the state must have a particular role in that. And what role would that be? And maybe I would add a second question to that, namely, especially when we think internationally, think of the US-China or European-China conflict or Middle East or what have you, or Russia conflict. So clearly trade or economy in a larger sense is used as a weapon to a certain extent. Now, can we really get along without, let's say, tariffs or something like that? For instance, we are highly dependent on China on a large number of existential goods. So is it a good idea? Free market could say, well, so what? They produce it the cheapest and that's fine. But this brings us in a significant geopolitical danger, I could argue, on the other side. So in that, let's say, amalgam of ideas, what would you see is the role of the state in that sense?
Well, overall, if you're asking me first about where I see the principle of government action, what's the government's role, then I could actually just quote from this interview that I did with Elon Musk recently, when he said that he thought that the government should be as the referee on a playing field of soccer or what have you, who's making the rules, making sure that they're upheld equally so that no one gets any specific favors. And that's what the government should do, basically. If the government keeps growing, suddenly eventually you have more referees than players on the field, and that's not a good game. Then we don't see the artistic and the innovation on the playing field that we're interested in, but regimentation and centralization, and that's not a good thing. But with that, upholding the rules comes taking care of basic security, both internal security, making sure that people play by the rules and they don't steal, they don't use violence and force against others, and also making sure that no outsiders do, foreign governments, Russia or China trying to invade us. So that's a role that I see for governments. What does that mean when it comes to trade? Because I want that security, but I also want as free trade as possible, because that's about basic freedom and competition for the incumbents. Well, I think it is a little bit complicated. There is a role, I think, to really vet and scrutinize some aspects of trade with China to make sure that it doesn't eat itself into investments in physical and digital infrastructure in our countries, or that Russia does the same. I'm not sure that the gas pipeline from Russia to Europe made much sense. So there's a role to scrutinize such investments. However, I'm a little bit concerned about those who think that we should sort of shut down trade generally or entirely for two reasons. One of them being that I think one of the things that keeps potentially bad actors on the right side is that they know that there's a potential win-win game they can play with us. If they can see that there's a potential future for them in our world economy, at least that creates an incentive for them not to act completely according to their instincts and identity. And because that would be a worse world. If we impose those costs instantly, the sanctions, and block all the investments, for what's to stop them from going really bad? So there's still a case for the, the traditional 19th century free trader said that if goods don't cross borders, soldiers will. Unfortunately, it's not enough, but at least it's an incentive to stop doing that. The other thing is that I think it's important for our safety and security to diversify the goods that we're buying from different places. And yes, that means not being overly dependent on any one single potentially bad actor like Russia or China. But it also means that they might have a role in diversifying away from some of our good neighbors who might also use trade as a weapon, not because they're bad, but because they happen to end up in the same kind of demand situation that we're in. So let me just take one brief example. During the pandemic, when Sweden and Spain and Italy desperately needed face masks and personal protective equipment, the governments that did the most to stop us from getting hold of these goods was actually Germany and France, that suddenly imposed export bans on these goods. And the country that saved us was China, because they scaled up their production so much and could sell to us. That's not because China is a better actor or a better friend of ours. That's because Germany and France ended up in the pandemic at precisely the same moment in time that we did. Because, most problems, most disasters happen to a region at a particular time. And if you're completely dependent on trade with that region, well, it could be game over when problems hit. Then it makes sense to have other potential sources on the other side of the planet, because they, in China's case, they went through the first phase, and during that phase, they could buy personal protective equipment from us. And then they came out of the first phase and opened up their factories so that they could sell to us. So that's why I think for our security, we should diversify and not concentrate our supply chains, as much diversity as possible.
I know that your time is limited today, so I would like to slowly land the plane, so to speak, but I would like to do it with a big question. Okay, big question that has two parts. And I would like to start with the status quo. I think when you look at the world, the status quo, I think, is sort of, simply put, twofold. One is the former industrial or Western countries, who, if we agreed before, are sort of stuck in maybe parts of overregulation, and we are sort of not in the best shape here. That's the one situation. But the other situation is, we have a number of other countries like Africa, who is in dire straits since decades. We have South America, other developing countries. And the conference, I think you mentioned with Elon Musk, was, if I remember correctly, a libertarian conference, where there was also the context with Argentine and Milei. This is also something I would really like to ask you, because I have also relatives in Argentine, and I mean, what they tell me about the situation in Argentina over the last decades is horrible, right? So there is actually a country that has a lot of resources and also well-educated people, but they fail so dramatically over decades. The big question sort of convolutes to the question okay, so what can we do in the West to improve? But also, would your ideas help these developing countries? And what is your idea about Milei? Do you think that he is a bit of a colorful character, but do you think this is in any way an interesting thing to observe? Maybe with the addition that, for instance, people like Jason Hickel constantly talk that the North is abusing the South, and this is why we have to stop capitalism and that sort of idea.
Yeah, there are lots of parts to that question. Let me start with Argentina, because Argentina should be a memento mori for all of us, that we too shouldn't take anything for granted, that there are risks. Always 100 years ago, Argentina was one of the richest countries on the planet, and a country that many Europeans fled to build a better life. With its nature, with its fertile soil, cattle, education, it had the future going for it. But then they ended up with populist, protectionist, and socialist governments that wanted to protect them from world markets and protect their relative wealth. And that resulted in 80 years of stagnation. So, as it's sometimes being said, it's not really true, but there's some truth to it. It's the only country in the world that was a developed country that became a developing country, chose to be so because of Peronist policies that failed. But that tells us that no one can take it for granted. If Argentina can fail for such a long time, so can we if we make the wrong decisions. On the other hand, there are countries close by, Chile and Peru and Colombia, that have over the past few decades grown rapidly and dramatically by opening up these two things that I talked about when it comes to openness. More inclusion in the local economy, giving people more economic freedom so that they can begin to experiment with their ideas, and opening up their economies to the rest of the world. Chile has sort of almost South European living standards by now. And there are countries like that on every continent that are making rapid progress. You know, the country that has grown the fastest since the 1960s is not an East Asian country. It's Botswana in Southern Africa. So there are always alternative ways. And to me, what this suggests is that it's not the shutting capitalism out method that helps countries to develop. On the contrary, they are the ones who failed. If we want a recent South American example, it's Venezuela, which was the richest country in South America 20 years ago, and now has made itself the poorest country of South America in just 20 years. With this whole system of price controls and nationalization and tariffs, that's the method that never works, because it puts all the power in the hands of a few people who can exploit all the others and stop them from coming up with better methods and more growth in the future. So, you know, it's a warning to us all that no one can ever sort of think that growth is our fate, that it happens automatically. But it's also something hopeful, because it means that it might work on every continent. The moment you start to open up economies and societies, you create dramatic growth. And, you know, over the past 20 years, just since the turn of the millennium, almost 140,000 people have been lifted out of extreme poverty every day. 140,000 people every day for more than 20 years. And it happened in the places that started to open up to the rest of the world. So what does that mean? It means, you know, in Argentina, if they manage to return to the kind of institutions that built its wealth in the past, it has great potential for the future. It'll be difficult because it's in a horrible situation after these 80 years of stagnation, with debts that are unsustainable, with this terrible currency and high inflation, incumbents in business and trade unions that want to block everything. It's difficult to do anything about it. Is Milei the right person to do it? You know, he's a colorful character, as you say. And as a Swede, I think that he's swearing too much. He's got too aggressive rhetoric. It seems
the chainsaw doesn't help too, right?
That's right. But after having been there and talked to advice of him and so on, I think there's a method to his madness. I think there's a deep understanding of what kind of institutions Argentina need. I'm not sure if they'll be able to get there, but if they do, Argentina has tremendous potential. It's still one of the best places to go to in the world, I think, with its culture, with its nature. Imagine if it also got its economic and political act together. And that's the reason why it's one of the most important countries right now, because it would send an important signal to the rest of the world that if it's possible to fix such a country, then it should be possible anywhere.
Yeah, I would really hope so. Maybe as a last question, are you rather optimistic about the future? And maybe as a side question, what would you advise a young person who maybe starts to study or is in his studies to make a contribution in the world?
It's interesting when I get this question, because obviously it's easy to be pessimistic if you look at politics, for example. And, you know, if you're looking to major parties or the recent US election campaign or what have you, it seems like everybody wants strongmen and government protection and tariffs and price controls and what have you. On the other hand, I'm an incredible optimist the moment I gaze away from politics and look at society. When I look at what goes on in the laboratories, factories, in agriculture, and so on, because the ideas out there are astonishing. And I think we've seen breakthroughs just in the recent decade that has shocking potential in a good way. You know, we suddenly have AI, and we suddenly, all of us have access to supercomputers with the accumulated knowledge of mankind. We have drones, we have self-driving cars, we have CRISPR-Cas9 biotech, we have mRNA technology, we have vaccines against cancer in clinical tests. Right now, we are starting to give back hearing to the deaf. We're starting to deal with blindness because of new technological breakthroughs. We have drugs against obesity, which are still a bit shameful and expensive and difficult, but I'm pretty sure that in 10 years' time, it'll be cheap and easily accessible to everybody. We are beginning to beat back malaria and polio and, you know, scourges of mankind that just 10, 20 years ago seemed like hopeless things. They are the things that are happening often silently in civil society, in economics, in research and science. And so that makes me hopeful about the world. And here's the question then, what do you do as a young person going into this world? You know, I believe in decentralization. I don't think I have the answers on where to go to do these things. But if you really want to make a contribution to society, look at these places that are exciting and in culture, in economics, in technology, and see whether you can make a contribution there. Or in changing the intellectual discourse, in changing politics, if we can only give these new innovations a little bit more freedom to experiment and come up with new solutions, that will get us to the future faster. So that's not a bad way to spend your life, to think about what you can do to repay the debt that all of us have to previous generations who gave us literacy and poverty reduction and the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment. What can we do to sort of carry that torch to the next generation?
I think that is a very nice sentiment in the end. Johan, thank you very much for the very interesting conversation.
Thank you.